Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Brookings for this event today on electricity rates, despite the heavy snow that was predicted. My name is Sanjay Patnaik, and I'm the Director of the Center on Regulation and Markets here at Brookings. And this event today kicks off a new work stream at our center that we're implementing on AI and energy with a special focus on energy affordability. When you think about it, electricity is really the lifeblood of our economy. Without it, we can't work, we can't study, we can't run our offices or our factories. It is a major driver of economic growth and the engine that keeps our modern society functioning well. Over many years, the US experienced pretty flat demand for electricity, but this started to change quite significantly a few years ago when demand for electricity started to rise rapidly. As a consequence, we are now witnessing a significant increase in electricity rates across the country, which is putting immense burdens on many households who are already struggling with cost of living crisis in many other areas. To explore the reasons for these electricity rate rises that we have seen and that we are experiencing, and to explore what our country, our policymakers could do about it, we have a great lineup of experts here today. We're going to start off with a fireside chat with Dr. Joseph Bowring, who is the President of Monitoring Analytics. Since 1999, Dr. Bowring has been the independent market monitor for PJM Interconnection, responsible for all market monitoring activities of PJM, which is the largest regional transmission organization in the United States. Afterwards, we'll move into a panel where I'm joined by three experts. Brendan Pierpoint, he's the Electricity Director of Energy Innovation. He will join virtually. Abe Silverman, who is here in the room, an Assistant Research Scholar at Johns Hopkins University, and Dr. Ryan Weiser, a Senior Scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. We have received a lot of advanced questions, so thank you for that. And I will try to work them into my fireside and into my questions for the panelists. But for anyone here in the audience today, if you have questions, we're going to take questions for the panel, not for the fireside, because it's shorter. My team is walking around with flashcards. Please wave them down, and you can write down the questions, and I will try to work them in, okay? It's a very interesting and hot topic, I think, and so without further ado, I would like to ask Joe to please come up here. Welcome, and thank you so much for doing this today.
Thank you.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your role related to PJM. Kind of like what do you do for them?
So, hello everyone. I'm the market monitor. That's it. That's all I have to say. So we have three fundamental roles defined by FERC in the PJM tariff. One is monitoring, making sure that participants behave competitively. And if you can think of a creative way to violate the rules or exercise market power, believe me, someone's thinking of it right now or has already tried to implement it. But we also monitor PJM's behavior. PJM single-handedly has more effect on the market than any single participant by far. Secondly, we do reporting. If you go to our webpage, you'll see every quarter we put out an 850-page document called the State of the Market Report, which covers all aspects of PJM markets. And last but not least, and this is controversial for some, even though it's written in the tariff, I've been yelled at by members of the PJM board in public that I shouldn't do this part, and that is make market design recommendations. And part of what we're doing in this whole data center space is doing exactly that, making recommendations about how to modify the market so that data centers can be integrated, but without imposing billions of dollars of costs on everybody else.
Great, thank you. This is a very helpful context. So let's dive right in. So according to the most recent monitoring analytics report, the total cost of wholesale power in the PJM market increased by more than 40% between 2024 and 2025. Is this kind of like a typical year-to-year fluctuation, or is this really something else that is going on here?
It's something else. So when people, there's a counter narrative building out there that says prices aren't really going up. There's some academic papers that prices aren't really going up. Well, it really depends on where you start and where you end. If you start in 2001 and end in 2024, nominally or inflation adjusted, prices were fairly flat. CPI adjusted, absolutely flat. Nominal went up somewhat, but not huge. A 50% increase year over year is fairly unusual. But if you think about January of 25 to January of 26, price increase was 100%.
Wow.
So, but you have to, when you're thinking about PJM prices, it's wholesale market prices, think about three components. There's the energy piece, there's capacity, and there's transmission. And it's best to look at it in the long haul. If you look at a figure over 20 years, 25 years, you'll see the energy piece is very volatile. The energy piece is about 50%, but it can vary from 40% to 80% of the total wholesale power bill. So it fluctuates. And on the bottom, we have transmission, which is slowly ramping up. And we have capacity, which was pretty low and now is taking a big bump up. So now it's about 50% energy, 25% transmission, and 25% capacity. For the first time in 2019, the cost of transmission exceeded the cost of capacity, which is pretty shocking, and a result of pretty significant increases year over year in transmission costs. When you think about what's happening, recent events, in particular data center and all the impacts they had, have changed prices significantly year over year. And in fact, the impact of data centers on capacity prices was first felt in bills June 1st of 2025, which is when you first started to see some of the political reaction, because it didn't actually hit until 2025. But we've now locked in prices in PJM, we work in the capacity market delivery year, so June 1st to May 31st. So we have 25, 26 locked in, 26, 27 is locked in, 27, 28 is locked in, and we're about to have another auction for 28, 29. So those price increases are locked in right now. The impact of data center is irreversible at the moment. It's been locked into capacity market prices. It's a done deal.
And so when you look at those increases, is this really mostly related to PJM, or do you see that across the country? Are these like factors that are locally, or is it like nationally driven?
So I don't pretend to, it's not going to stop me, by the way, but I don't pretend to know about the other markets anywhere near the level of detail I know about PJM, because we study PJM. But I think there are some longer term trends that affect everyone, and which will mean that everyone will be affected. One of the things to remember about PJM is it's a market. MISO is not really a market. SPP is not really a market. California is not really a market. New England and New York are much more like markets, much more like PJM. But what that means practically for all this is that PJM has single clearing price markets, which is the way markets typically work. And if the marginal price is high, you're going to set the price high for everybody. So one of the underlying dynamics is, in addition to the fact, so you have this slowdown. If you're doing embedded costs, it's going to be a slower impact. It'll take longer to catch up. So MISO, for example, has cost of service regulation to set their capacity values, whereas PJM has a market. But the key point there is the marginal cost is higher than the average cost. Economists like to have trite little phrases. So usually I say, well, it's supply and demand, but I'm branching out. Marginal cost is higher than average cost. That really, if you look back over the last 50 years of power prices and all the politics and PERPA and everything that has come since, it's really all about that. It's about whether marginal prices are higher than average prices. So what does that mean? It means in the case of PJM capacity market, which is tight, it's absolutely tight right now. There's no surplus. In fact, there's a shortfall. If you need another megawatt, you got to pay the cost of a brand new turbine. That sets the price for everybody. So marginal cost is higher. So as load increases, prices go up. And despite what you've heard from the academics at Duke, it is absolutely not true that there's free power to be had and thousands of megawatts of data centers can be served for nothing. That is nonsense. There's no free capacity. There's no spare capacity. PJM is tight. And if you add more demand, add the need for more capacity, everyone's going to pay that cost because you're driving up the marginal cost. That's really the underlying dynamic.
That's actually really interesting. So when you talked about the wholesale prices, how do the prices usually get passed on to ratepayers? Can you explain that process a little bit?
No, but I'll try. So wholesale power prices are set by the PJM market. They're then passed down to customers in a variety of ways. So think about the wholesale power market. Back in 1999, the markets were not deregulated, but restructured. There's no deregulation has never occurred. It's not going to occur. It shouldn't occur. But PJM established a market, a power market, effective April 1st, 1999, in which power prices were set by competitive offers and demand, and prices were locational marginal prices. So the next entity in this chain of payment is what's called the EDCs, the electric distribution companies. So they're think of them as the old-fashioned transmission owners. So in PJM, it's PECO and PPL and PSE&G, so on. And there's been some combination, but that's basically zone by zone. Think of it. But within that, when you have individually restructured states, so remember, some states decided to allow competition to serve retail load. Think of them as restructured states. So in those states, there's also a separate entity called a load serving entity, LSE. And if you don't know yet about PJM, it's all acronyms all the time. So EDC, the TOs, the transmission owners, there we go, transmission owners, zone, and the LSEs. An LSE, any one of you could start an LSE. All you need is a computer and maybe some credit, and you could start an LSE. You bid in a state auction to pick up a tranche of load, and it's purely financial. You're buying energy and capacity, ancillary services, and selling power. So it gets to the retail customer one of those two ways. And then the state public utility commissions have a role because, for example, in New Jersey, as Abe knows very well, there are lots of things added to the bill in addition to the cost of wholesale power. So there's a cost of distribution system, which is part of it, all the customer-related functions of the EDCs, but also there are other additions. I mean, I hope people are not still paying off stranded costs from the nuclear power plants from the restructuring, but they might be. But there are other adders that the state commission adds on. So wholesale costs, I'm not even sure what portion of the retail bill that typically is, but the wholesale costs, generation, transmission, and capacity, and then that gets passed down through the EDCs and the LSEs.
Great, this is very interesting. So I want to dive a little bit more into kind of like the causes for the rate increases, right? And you mentioned the data centers earlier, so I'm curious, like you hear a lot of like analysts write different things. You see, we had electrification that was being pushed by the IRA under the federal government a few years ago, and on the state level decarbonization efforts, which also like led to more demand for electricity with EVs and electric water heaters, etc. Then we have the AI data centers that is really a big boom over the last couple of years. We also have other utilities that are having to incur costs to harden their infrastructure against new extreme weather events. So kind of like if you look at all these different factors, what are you think the most important factors driving those increases?
Yeah, in the case of PJM, in the case of the capacity market, which is where the really dramatic changes are coming from, it's data centers, and it's nothing but data centers. And the people who start trying to muddy the waters with EVs and electrification, that's not true. Absolutely not true. There's no data to support it. It's not true. Our data shows that it's data centers. Last 3 capacity auctions, $23 billion in additional costs for everyone else, a result of data centers. And just to put that in perspective, that's about 40% of the cost of capacity. So in the last, it's useful to think about in perspective. So if you think about the costs, there were extra costs incurred in the 25-26 auction for capacity, beginning June 1st. That divided by the total power bill for the entire year of 2025 was about 14%. So that's a huge piece. Data centers, capacity is a relatively small piece, as I said, 25% of the total bill. The significant increases in capacity costs from the data centers translated into overall, think of it, about 14% of the total bill in 2025. It's not a precise comparison because one runs from May to June, the other runs from January to December, but that's the basic idea.
Okay, and when you look at the division, you mentioned it earlier, between generation and transmission, kind of what are some of the major drivers there? Is it a lack of generation? Is it like the transmission lines not coming online fast enough? Is it a combination?
Yeah, no, it's a great point about not coming on fast enough. So one of the long-standing issues in PJM has been managing the so-called queue. right? And the queue is you have to get in line to be hooked up to provide power to PJM because it's an interconnected grid. And the rules in PJM, appropriately enough, unlike in ERCOT, rules in PJM require the generators to pay for their own incremental interconnection costs. That could be anywhere from $0 to a couple $100 million, depending on where you're located. Gives you an incentive to locate where there's relatively cheap gas and where you can hook up to the transmission system relatively cheaply. But PJM had, I think what's fair to say, a really badly mismanaged queue process, which never made the transition thoughtfully from a couple of gas-fired combined cycles every year to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little solar and wind resources. So PJM stacked them all from bottom to top, and there was an incentive for developers to put projects in that didn't plan to finish. Right, so they were basically speculating on spots in the queue. So what happens when the fifth one out of 150 projects in the queue decides to pull out? Every single project after that has to be restudied. Just imagine that going on and on and on. It's insanely ineffective and inefficient. Wow. And it caused a total bog down in the PJM process. At the high point, there were 250,000 megawatts in the queue waiting to come on. So eventually, and way too late, PJM figured out they needed to solve it. Did a pretty radical fix, actually stopped taking any more for a year. They by imposing additional requirements, they reduced the queue from 250,000 to about 40 or 50,000. They imposed stronger financial requirements, so you really had to be serious about being in the queue. But people are still not coming online. There is so much uncertainty created. I think the role of the queue is understated when you think about why we're short capacity. So the queue is a huge part of it. Transmission costs are very significant. I don't know if you follow it, but there's been a debate since order, I should remember the number, 888, I think it was. No, that's not it. What's the number of the transmission order? Maybe order 1000, which said that it's supposed to be competition to provide transmission. But PJM and the TOs have managed to resist that. There have been some competitive projects, but by and large, the transmission owners figured out a way to evade that for the bulk of the project. So a lot of transmission is simply built under rate-based rate of return, which, as we know, is a relatively inefficient, costly way to do things. But the competitors, unfortunately, also playing by rules which really they want to become regulated utilities rather than competitors. So the competition for transmission has hardly been a panacea, but that's part of it. So we've needed more transmission, growing very significantly. But primarily, we're out of capacity. PJM cleared 600 megawatts short of the requirement for the first time ever. So we went from a 1 in 10 reliability standard to about 1 in 4, according to what PJM said in a meeting recently. So, I mean, as you can see, that's a radical reduction in reliability. And if you keep adding, if you add 60,000 more gigawatts, 60,000 more megawatts of data center load, you don't have a generation, it's not going to work.
That's really interesting. So when we look at these three parts, you talked a lot about the queue. Like, if you could advise them ideally to reform the queue process, what could they do?
Well, I mean, I think they've done most of it, but it's still relatively inefficient. That is, there's a lot of manual parts of it. So they've actually apparently hired Google and in one of their creative software sites to try to automate some of it. So they certainly need to do that. But the idea that you have to wait for a year or two in a queue to decide how much money you have to spend, and then you can't even guarantee you're going to come on, it's a problem. You have to. The point is to reduce the uncertainty, to give people a fast track. If they're ready to go, ready to become commercial, they should be allowed to come on as quickly as they can. And
who determines when they can come on? Like, how big is the staff at the office? Like,
I
working on the queue. I'm curious.
I would say the planning group is definitely understaffed.
Okay, so that's another issue.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the transmission lines, I mean, transmission is complicated, right? It has a lot of permitting issues at the local, state, and federal level. What are some of the reforms that you think might be helpful here to bring transmission lines?
I mean, interesting, it goes to the queue and transmission lines, but to the queue as well, which is that states and localities can do a much better job of expediting the process of getting permits, right, and being able to come online. There are lots of local. I mean, and they serve a function, of course, and you have to protect the local folks. And I personally believe in NIMBY. I'm not sure I'm all the way to banana, but I don't want a transmission line in my backyard, nor do I want a data center next to me. So I understand those. So people have to have their ability to intervene, but that process has to be as efficient as possible. So that would affect both transmission siting and just generation siting as well.
So really kind of like work at the local and state level to at least unclog some of the transmission bottlenecks.
I mean, when you get down to it, it's all nitty-gritty detail that you really have to work through. There's no kind of one big policy recommendation. I mean, I can say easily fix the queue process, but it's actually really hard to do it.
Yeah. And what about generating capacity? I mean, I think that's probably a bigger issue. What do you see as some of the more promising new generation capacities that are coming online that might be faster online? What kind of energy sources do they rely on?
Yeah, so PJM has relatively little renewables, relatively few intermittents. It's certainly less than 7 or 8% solar and wind. Solar is growing faster than wind at the moment. As you know, offshore wind, for reasons that escape me, has been largely canceled, as we know. So to me, we're going to see a lot more gas-fired generation. We'll continue to see growth, I think, of solar and wind, which makes sense. It's cheap energy, and it's definitely competitive with gas-fired combined cycles. But we're going to need more gas-fired combined cycles to get through situations like we did in the winter storm Firm, the prior winter in January of 2025. But one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough in the whole capacity market area is the need for more firm gas infrastructure. Because if you want a power plant to be on in the winter, you better have a way to get it gas, because that's when everybody else wants the gas. So if it's purely interruptible gas, you're not likely to get it.
So the pipeline infrastructure, basically.
Right, exactly.
And so also when you look at like the entire PJM region, like, does it matter much where some of this new demand is coming from, where the data centers are located, on where the rates go up? Does it matter that in Virginia you have most of the data centers? Will that affect the Maryland ratepayers, Delaware ratepayers? How does that work?
Yeah, it does. So there are billions of dollars are invested in transmission to get power to the Virginia data centers, Data Center Alley. But the way those costs are assigned, they were not assigned to the data centers. They're not even assigned to Virginia. They were assigned using their normal allocation process, which meant that customers in Maryland, Delaware, primarily, were paying billions of dollars of costs for transmission upgrades to serve the data centers. I think it's very difficult to actually directly assign transmission to data centers. If every data center paid their share just on what's called in PJM a NITS basis, or an average rolled in transmission rate, I think everyone would be better off than trying to assign them directly, because FERC just put out this co-location order, and it's the only docket number I remember, if I can remember it, I think EL 25-49, which basically tried to get cute with cost allocation. Said, well, if you agree not to use more than a certain amount, we're only going to assign you part of the transmission system. But it's not about changing what actually gets constructed. It's not actually, in my view, not about changing the actual costs. It is purely about allocation, which is always how large customers have avoided paying what I would regard as their fair share of the transmission costs. So the co-location order is very significant because it's attempting to change the allocation of costs for data centers.
That's interesting.
But data centers, just where you began was a very important point, because PJM is a locational market. LMP is the locational marginal pricing on the energy side. That's fundamental to the way PJM works. That means that every one of thousands and thousands of nodes has potentially a different price depending on what the short-run marginal cost of generating power at that node is. Same thing's true for capacity. You cannot serve a data center in Newark, New Jersey with generation in Chicago. But most of the proposals we're dealing with are not focusing on that question you raised, which is about locational. So capacity market's locational, it clears locationally. One of our recommendations for how to deal with this is to have a separate auction just for data centers, but it has to be locational. It has to have all the elements of the standard auction. It has to have transmission constraints. Has to have the location of the data centers, has to have the location of the generators in order for it to work. Location, it really matters in PJM.
So then you would kind of like allocate the costs according to like how much transmission line they're using, where they're located.
Right.
Is that what you have in mind?
What I have in mind is everyone pays their share of the transmission system, which is just whatever the billing determinant is, whether it's peak load or average load. You pay it no matter what.
Yeah.
But for generation, What we're proposing in the market monitoring unit is that data centers be required to either bring their own new generation themselves, which some are doing, or pay through this auction to have capacity assigned to them, but it would have to be capacity that works. One of the things that we think is a bad idea, and interestingly, the White House, both through their principles that they published a few weeks ago, as well as the statement that's supposed to come out this week about data centers, recognizes correctly that they have to be served by new generation, because otherwise you're cannibalizing the old generation, you're making everyone else short of capacity, and you're making it everyone else's problem. So new data centers need new generation.
And so then I'm curious, like I've seen some proposals in Congress that would require data centers to kind of like build their own supply completely independent from the main grid. What do you think about that?
No. I mean, that makes no sense. So the grid is the grid, and it's there for a reason. It provides backup. So there was this proposal for a while called co-location, which pretended that a data center would be, and this actually happened with Talon Susquehanna Nuclear Power Plant in Pennsylvania. There was an Amazon data center. You pretend that you're behind it, and therefore you don't have to pay for any of the grid, and you're basically entirely isolated from the grid. But that's not true. No one is ever isolated from the grid. And for example, when that data center goes off, the power from the power plant is injected into the grid suddenly. Or when the power plant goes off, the load from the data center still exists. Everyone relies on the grid. I think it's a fantasy to pretend that you don't have to. I mean, it is literally possible to isolate yourself from the grid, but then you have to provide all of the ancillary services, all the backup, all the reserves. It's very inefficient from a social perspective and expensive from an individual perspective to try to be off the grid.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about it, we don't treat other industrial customers differently, right? Like, I'm curious what your thoughts are. What makes data centers so different from, like, I don't know, a manufacturing plant, other than, like, obviously the huge energy demand? But there are other industrial customers that also use a lot of energy.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. It's been a cause for some debate. So people ask me about that, and they say, aren't you discriminating against the data centers?
No.
And I say, yes. But the Federal Power Act says you can't engage in undue discrimination. So I think it's appropriate that data centers pay their own way. It's a unique phenomenon. Think of 60,000 more megawatts of demand of data centers. The total winter peak load is about 145. Summer peak load is about 165 or so. So it's a huge increase in the amount of capacity. The marginal costs, as I said before, are extremely high. It's unprecedented, unusual, and so therefore I think it is appropriate to treat them differently. But you're right. I mean, there are large industrial loads. What I call organic load has been growing pretty slowly. It has not caused these kind of issues for the grid. It will cause prices to go up, but much more slowly and gradually in a way that people can absorb them. This is a tsunami, and it has to be addressed. Either you tell the data centers that they can't hook up until there's enough capacity, or you figure out a way to ensure that they bring their own.
Do we have the capacity? And so then when you think about like ratepayers, where should they turn to, right? Like how is the responsibility for the electric system divided up between local, state, and federal or cross-state? Like where can they turn and say, look, this is too much for us, we can't afford that, we need reform?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, partly they can turn to their local public utility commissions, but the public utility commissions have no control over, over PJM. So public advocates and the public utility commissions participate in the PJM stakeholder process, but as they keep pointing out correctly, they have a relatively small voice. So it's FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, really controls transmission costs and generation costs, the bulk of the wholesale power costs. And the local public utility commissions and governors control the local costs. So, but the big source of rate increases for customers has been in PJM, the capacity market. And customers have no recourse other than to go to the FERC. And that's very difficult for individual customers to do.
And do you think, I mean, I've seen pushes at the state level of trying to subsidize energy or like helping low-income families. Do you think would that help? Like in the long term, or is that more like a short-term patch to help families get through the winter?
Having income redistribution is fine. It makes sense to ensure that across income distribution, people are being treated fairly. But that doesn't address the underlying issue, which is that someone's going to have to pay the higher costs unless we address the root cause of the costs. Great. So I would say more competition in transmission, and make sure the data centers bring their own new generation.
Great. Thank you so much. This was great.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll invite Abe up here, and then our two virtual
Nice job.
speakers. Hello, Ryan and Brandon, I assume. Can you hear me?
Sure yes, can. We can hear you.
Yep. Perfect. Well, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us here today. It's a pleasure to have all three of you here. We're gonna try to dive a bit more into detail of all these different electricity rate increases that we've seen. Maybe you can, each one of you, start a little bit about kind of like your own area of work and like how it relates to what we currently see. Abe, you want to start?
Yeah, so my name is Abe Silverman. I like to refer to myself as a recovering FERC attorney. So I've been sort of in this energy space my entire career. Most of my career, I've actually worked for industry as a representative of a large power plant developer. And then I had the opportunity to make more money, and so I went to work for the state of New Jersey at their Public Service Commission. That's a joke, by the way. Made a lot less money. And so I was there for 4 years during the early days of the Murphy administration, really focusing on how we deal with markets and PJM and where we get our power from. And then when I left New Jersey, I moved to originally Columbia University, and now I'm a research scholar at Johns Hopkins University, talking about why are our electric bills going up and how can we decarbonize at a price that we can all afford.
Great, thank you. Brandon, please.
Great. Oh, thank you for having me. I'm Brendan Pierpont. I direct Energy Innovation's electricity policy research. We're a small think tank research organization looking at a similar set of questions to what Abe just outlined. How do we address affordability challenges? How do we meet the climate goals that we need to meet to address growing climate risks? And do so while protecting customers. So I've been with Energy Innovation for just about 2 years. Before that, long career in a variety of research capacities, supporting groups from advocates to independent research NGOs. So I'm glad to be here. Glad to be joined by a great panelist today. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Ryan, please.
Yeah, greetings all, and thanks to Brookings for putting on this event. Certainly a hot topic these days, that's for sure. So yeah, I've been at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab for some number of decades now, tracking and analyzing the US power sector. And a little over a year ago, I and my team opted to turn our attention a bit to the now hot topic of retail electricity price trends. And so we've been steeped into in trying to understand some of those trends and drivers over the last year or so. Happy to be here.
Great, thank you so much. So let's dive right in, and maybe Ryan, we can start with you. You said you look at retail prices and probably presumably across the United States. So when you look at the potential drivers for these rate increases, we heard the perspective from PJM. There are a lot of different factors at play. Data centers are at least being tossed around, electrification, hardening against climate risk. What are the factors that you mostly find when you look at different areas in the United States?
Yeah, so maybe to start there, I want to emphasize that the retail price increases that we're seeing across the country are not in any way uniform. There are some states and regions that have seen very significant price increases well above the rate of inflation. And there are an equal, if not larger number of states that have seen price increases, but price increases that have been running short of or less than overall inflationary pressures. And so when you talk about places where retail prices have spiked the most, you're really talking about my home state in California, the Pacific Seaboard, the northeastern states, New England and New York, and now very recently, as Abe will certainly speak to as well, and as Joe Bowring just described, the PJM states. So those are the states that have seen the most outsized increases in retail prices over not just the last year, but really the last 5-6 years or so. In our research at LBL, every state has its own story to tell. I want to be really clear here, but ultimately 4 factors are the primary ones that have driven prices up in those locations where prices have gone up. First, though we talk about electrons quite a lot, the poles and the wires, the transmission and the distribution system play a very, very significant role here. We can talk more about that, I'm sure, in the further Q&A. State clean energy policies, they matter, and they can increase prices in some circumstances. That's especially true in some of the northeastern states that have very aggressive clean energy policies and programs, but that don't have the same resource quality. It's not as windy and sunny in Massachusetts as it is in many other parts of the country. Natural gas prices. Natural gas prices have gone through some serious gyrations over the last 5 or 6 years. Of course, at the onset of the Ukraine-Russia war, gas prices increased dramatically. That impacted retail electricity prices, really in any state that is highly dependent on natural gas. Natural gas prices have also increased rather substantially over the last year. And let me just be really clear, natural gas in general is pushing retail prices down. There's a reason that retail electricity prices in the US are lower than in many other industrial countries. Low-cost natural gas is one of those reasons. But it's a volatile commodity. The price varies, and we as consumers confront that volatility. And then finally, load growth and contraction. And here the story is in no means simple or unidirectional. We will certainly talk, Abe will certainly talk about load growth and really expected load growth in PJM and its impact on increasing prices. Certainly that was the nature of your fireside chat as well with Joe. But I also want to emphasize that the states that have seen the largest price increases over the last 6 years are those that have had contracting load. Think about the states I talked about, California, the New England states, New York. Load has declined in most of those states. And so it's hard to claim that load growth has pushed prices higher when the very states that have seen the highest price increases are the states where load has been shrinking. We could talk about the mechanics there, but I guess the bottom line here is that the load growth story is not a story that's fully been told, to be sure, but it's also not a simple story.
Great, thank you. That's very interesting. Brandon, over to you. What are your thoughts on this in your research?
Yeah, I think when we've looked at this same set of questions, we've certainly identified a lot of the same trends that Ryan just overviewed. A large long-term upward trend in the infrastructure costs for transmission and distribution, which I think deserves some unpacking. When we look at the transmission side of that, we're raising our transmission costs over time, yet not building as many line miles. We're not building the long distance transmission that can actually tap into lower cost generation sources that would then have really material benefits on the overall cost of serving customers. Instead, we're building a lot of local projects, as Joe Bowring was describing, projects that fall outside of the FERC Order 1000 planning processes. And there's a disconnect, I think, between what we see in transmission costs and transmission spending and the potential benefits of that transmission in unlocking low-cost energy sources by getting those great wind resources from the wind belt over to the load centers of Northern Virginia and New Jersey. And on the distribution side, I think it's also quite a complicated story. There's some data from, I think it's survey data from Edison Electric Institute that suggests that somewhere around a third of distribution capital investment is adaptation, resilience, grid hardening investment. Another third is replacing aging infrastructure. And so when we are looking at what's going into that distribution spending, which is again this growing, one of the fastest growing components, it's not expanding the distribution system to meet growing load or electrification necessarily. It's in a high cost environment, replacing the aging infrastructure and making the grid more resilient. And so it's again a complicated spending picture. We do also see some of the same trends that Ryan was pointing out. The volatility of natural gas prices, where even a 1 year price spike or a 1.5 year price spike like we experienced in 2022, that can stick around on bills for several years at a time and well after the spot prices have come back down. And right now we're entering a new era of geopolitical uncertainty. So how that plays out, I think remains to be seen. And then, yes, very much agree on the complicated picture on load growth. I think a lot there is dependent on how that load growth shows up in planning processes or market structures like PJM's capacity market in terms of what ultimate impact it has on rates. So
great, thank you. Abe.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. Data centers, I refer to them, the whole industry, as a toddler. And like any 3 or 4 year old, which is basically how long this new AI industry has been around, it doesn't really know what it wants to be when it grows up. But if you ask it right now, it wants to be a scientist, astronaut, art teacher. It wants to do everything. And that's reflected in the amount of new generation, excuse me, let me take that back. The amount of new load that they're requesting to use. What is load? It's just using electricity. So we have the data centers coming in asking in the PJM region. So that's the mid-Atlantic region. We're in PJM right now, goes basically up to New York, down to the Carolinas, west to Chicago. And that region is seeing somewhere around 13 gigawatts of new load, mostly from data centers, wanting to come onto the grid a year. And let's talk a little bit about what that actually means, because I think it's helpful to unpack this a little bit. The city of Baltimore uses about 6.5 gigawatts of electricity every year. So we are talking about adding 2 Baltimores to the grid every year between now and the early 2030s, if you believe the projections. Put another way, that's approximately 10 new large nuclear power plants a year, which we are nowhere there. And so what we basically are saying is there is tens of billions of dollars of new energy infrastructure that is required to serve this class of customers, these new data centers. And the question becomes, who pays for it? And this is a great discussion. I'm really glad to be on with these two gentlemen because I actually rely on their work quite a bit. And so we see these sort of long-term trends, and prices go up and prices go down. And I think the question that I struggle with is, are the data centers different? Dr. Bowring talked about it being not undue discrimination. Yeah, I agree with that. I actually think data centers are different because we simply just do not have new cities coming to seeking to hook up to the grid on a daily basis, or at least we haven't until now. So it's not, I don't think it's a huge mystery about why we're seeing such large price increases. Because at the end of the day, this is just supply and demand, right? You can get as fancy as you want about it. But where we have fairly constant supply or supply that changes really slowly, and you have a ton of new demand coming onto the system, prices go up. And that's where we are right now.
Great, thank you. Ryan, I want to come back to you a little bit. So you mentioned that there's a lot of variation across states in rising electricity prices, and that even states that have not had any load growth, like in New York and other places, you still see the prices spiking. So what drives those price spikes? And why do you see so much difference across different states?
I think you see differences across different states simply because states are different. Some are hit by storms, winter storms, hurricanes, and have to rebuild. Others not. My home state of California, my electricity price has gone up dramatically, largely because of wildfire mitigation and liability insurance claims. Not a problem in many of the northeastern states, certainly not of the same magnitude. States have different policy mechanisms, different societal objectives and programs that they are seeking to achieve through electricity policy and regulation. And of course, states have different resource endowments, different resource mix. The supply-demand balance can vary by state and region as well. And so the fact that the underlying drivers of price increases vary across states should come really as no surprise. California, we've had declining load for a long time. Our prices have increased the most. It's not data centers. Data centers have played no role in increasing the prices in California. Indeed, the CEOs of the major electric utilities in the state have noted that they would welcome data centers because they would be able to spread some of the fixed costs of their electricity system over more megawatt hours, which mathematically reduces electricity prices. In California, the story is largely one of wildfire mitigation and liability insurance and increased distribution and transmission expenditures. The PJM story is a totally different story, and the data centers are a big part, not the only part, but a big part of that story. So I think it's ultimately just that we've got states differ because states differ.
Great, thank you. Abe, I want to talk to you a little bit. So you grew up in Maryland, and so Maryland is an interesting example. Maryland has seen a huge spike in electricity rates over the last year. There are a couple of reports that have attributed it to decarbonization strategies at the state level that Ryan also mentioned could play a role because they shut down several coal-fired power plants but didn't replace them with the same capacity. Supply and demand, right? Rate spiked. So what do you see the main reasons for the rate spikes in Maryland? Is that a case study that has lessons for other states on the East Coast and PJM?
Yeah, I really like Ryan's point. Every state is different. All happy families are happy in the same way. So Maryland has a couple things going on. So, how many people are Maryland ratepayers in the room? I'm guessing. Yeah, okay, all right. So you have all probably saw on June 1st of 2025, your electric rates went up. and the question is why? And so, it is a story of death by 1,000 cuts. There's a lot of individual pieces. But then the end of the story is the giant sledgehammer. So absolutely, we have seen transmission rates increase over the last few years, really almost across the entire country. And that is a major part of the story. We've seen distribution costs increase, and it is a lot of that local distribution piece. These are the wires leading to your house. So when you look at your electric bill, approximately half of it is state charges, the distribution system, those small wires, and then transmission, which is the bigger wires, right? And both of those are seeing the increases. The other half of the bill is what we call the supply portion. And this is the cost of generation and capacity and energy. And as everybody has noted, there's a lot of reasons why all those costs are going up. But the one that really hit us starting on June 1st, 2025, was what we call the capacity market. It's I often say the biggest threat to the clean energy transition is acronyms, and there are so many acronyms out there. Capacity is one of these kind of obscure concepts, but it's basically a payment in the future to make sure that we have the right number of generators in the right place on the system so that we don't have a supply-related outage more than once every 10 years. And what happened for Maryland in particular was we got hit, really whacked. I could say that because I'm from New Jersey these days. But we got whacked with very high increase where we went from record low capacity prices to record high capacity prices, basically in a single year. And what really changed? Yeah, absolutely. There were some generators, including fossil fuel resources, that retired because of either environmental reasons, but the real reason they retired is because of price signals. We had a surplus in capacity in PJM for years. We had record low capacity prices. And so a lot of particularly older coal resources and other older fossil fuel resources said, I'm out. The prices are telling me to retire. I'm going to follow the economics and I'm going to retire. And that's what happened with all those resources in Maryland, which are, I'm about to hit a milestone birthday. They're older than me. And for a power plant, that's really old. So what happened, though, is, you had rational economic responses, and then the data centers came. And it was the data centers that drove us from a condition of extra generation sitting around, not being heavily utilized, to a period where we are now short of our reliability targets starting in 2027. And that is a fundamental change. And yeah, there's a ton of different reasons. Everything costs more. I hate going to the grocery store these days. Everything is more expensive. That's true in the electric grid too. But the data centers and the resulting capacity price increases are what really, really hit Maryland extremely hard.
And you mentioned earlier in our conversation Delaware as well as an interesting example. Can you talk a little bit about Delaware?
Yeah, I'm really interested in this question about multi-state equity. So you have a lot of data centers coming in Virginia. I mean, it's Data Center Alley, right? It is the greatest concentration of whatever in the world. So they are using an incredible amount of power in Virginia. Pennsylvania has also recently gotten into the game and is attracting a lot of new data center load growth. You know who hasn't? Delaware. In fact, they are actively fighting a large data center that's trying to come to the state, largely because of these cost concerns. But despite the fact that Delaware is playing no part in the problem, they are getting hit with the same cost increases that the rest of us are seeing.
Interesting.
And this is where, you get this kind of like fascinating coalition of political players where you have the President of the United States and Governor Josh Shapiro and a number of other both Democrats and Republican governors in PJM talking about the idea that data centers need to pay their own way and that no individual, grandma shouldn't be paying more because of the data centers. And so it's been really interesting, and we see it playing out right here in this region, right in PJM, where Virginia, has an enormous budget surplus right now, largely because of data centers. And yet costs in Maryland and, as well as Virginia and Delaware are skyrocketing. And so it's this really interesting question. How do we design a market that encourages economic development, because we want that, encourages data centers and the taxes that they bring without taking the costs of all this new infrastructure and having it hit mom and pop consumers?
I think you hit on a really interesting point, which is what is the counterfactual, right? Like we want economic development. Economic development right now is in AI and not in, manufacturing of nails or steel bars. And so the question is how can we facilitate this in a way that doesn't ruin like private households at the same time, right? So Brandon, I want to turn to you a little bit. Like historically, when you had more load come on and more customers take off some of the load, this system cost could be spread over a broader base of customers. Do you expect this to continue, or do we see differences now with the data centers that make this model a bit more difficult?
Yeah, I think the short answer to this is that it really all depends. And it all depends on those market mechanisms, how they're structured. It all depends on utility planning processes and how they plan for this new load. And it depends on how quickly we can sort of build the infrastructure needed and how cost effectively we can build the infrastructure needed to support these new loads. And so when I think that there's certainly a significant opportunity in the long run to better utilize the existing infrastructure that we have. We have transmission, distribution infrastructure that might only be a couple hours a year that it's fully loaded, and most of the time you might be using it on an average of maybe a 40% utilization rate. So some of that there's a large opportunity to move more energy through that same infrastructure, spread those costs over more megawatt hours and reduce average rates, which I think is something that Ryan and his team found looking at historical trends of where there's growing load, there's often falling rates. But I think that really is only if there is headroom on the system to do that. And so what that says to me is there's two strategies. There's find where there's headroom, which there's virtually none of it left in the US, because I think where data centers have looked all over the US for opportunities to connect, and I think soaked up a lot of the existing remaining headroom on the system, or create that headroom. And so that's things like investing in energy efficiency across not just at those data center sites, but across all customers. It's investing in things like virtual power plants and demand flexibility that can actually create some space on the grid at the times to to avoid needing to build out the grid more. And so I think to the extent that we can accommodate this new load without really bulking up the amount of infrastructure that we're building to accommodate that new load, I think there is opportunity for, in the long run, average costs to come down. But again, the devil's in the details. If we're kind of constantly in this scarcity, that's really driving up high marginal costs of capacity in PJM, and we're not able to get out of that because we're not building fast enough and not creating the headroom that we need. That opportunity might go away without really realizing those benefits.
I think you
Yeah,
bring
maybe
up
if
a
I
really...
can.
Yeah, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, if I could just like jump in here
Yeah.
briefly. So I totally agree with Brendan that the headroom portion of this story is really important. And in many regions of the country, we are in effect out of headroom, absent ability to handle peak load in other ways. But I do think it's important to recognize that there's two other parts of this story as well. One of which is simply what is the incremental cost of new supply? There are a number of states that have seen very significant growth in load over the last 6 years. They simultaneously built new supply and retail prices declined in inflation adjusted terms. So they were not relying solely on headroom. Texas was not relying solely on headroom. I mean, heck, Texas has built more resources than any other region of the country over the last 6 years. So it's not just a matter of headroom. Headroom matters, for sure, it matters. But what also matters is what's that incremental cost of supply. And that's going to be easier to handle probably in still regulated markets than in truly competitive wholesale markets. There's a bit of an averaging effect that occurs in regulated markets that one does not benefit from in a true wholesale market. And of course, the other factor is the tariff structure and cost allocation. Even if large load customers impose significant incremental new costs on the system, if those very customers are asked to cover those costs, then the rest of the ratepayers are protected. And it just strikes me that a lot of our focus over the coming years is going to be on tariff structures and making sure that cost causation is done very carefully. Also a topic that in some ways is going to be easier in still regulated, vertically integrated markets where you've got a regulator, a utility, and a hyperscaler that can kind of figure it out among the three parties. It'll be a lot harder in restructured markets where you've got to kind of go through the entire process of wholesale market design, at least in part, to address some of those cost causation issues.
I think you bring up a really good point, and combining that with Brandon, I think scarcity is not like an option, right? Like we are in a national security race of really trying to win the AI race against China, so we want to build that capacity, and we do have probably to push harder to get some of the new generation online, as some states have shown successfully that they can. Brandon, I want to go back a little bit also on the early point that you made on that headroom, right? So we have seen, I would say, over the last 4 or 5 years, a push and pull on the clean energy policies. We've had the IRA that has pushed very heavily pro-electrification, obviously driving up demand for electricity. And now the IRA has been rolled back partially. So what do you expect the impact to be, kind of like going forward the next 5 to 6 years? Do you think a lot of the pressures that the IRA put on the grid for like electrification will be slower? Do you think that will impact what industries electrify, will impact like demand for EVs? I'm curious what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, so in terms of how the broad impacts on what customers pay, I think that it's fairly clear that in particular the tax incentives for the technology neutral clean energy tax incentives that applied to wind and solar are those going away means those costs of new generation are increasingly borne by customers rather than the federal tax base. So I think as you look to the especially the later in this decade, as we approach 2029, 2030, the lack of those tax credits just means utility customers are going to be paying more for that new supply. And it's not that the new supply is going to be all that different in its makeup. We're not going to, there might be some shifting on the margin between one type of resource and another. But by and large, what we have from most forecasts I have seen is that energy storage, solar, new natural gas are going to continue to dominate the new additions. And so what the net effect of removing those tax credits is going to be higher costs. So one thing that our modeling team did analysis looking at both the electricity supply tax credits and some of these the tax credits for EVs, for efficiency, for electrification, and found roughly 10% increase by 2035 in retail rates as a result of the bill overall. There is some reduction in that modeling of EV uptake of home electrification as a result of less tax incentives available to that. But those also show up on households' budgets because that means those customers are going to be paying more for fuel for say their internal combustion car rather than an EV car. And so when you kind of expand the scope to look at the whole household energy wallet, there's not necessarily significant savings accruing to them either through that. So at a high level, the HR1, the removal of some of those tax credits just means higher costs overall. I think it also injects a new level of uncertainty into the development of new resources. And I think we're seeing this with wind and solar projects, certainly, also with battery storage projects, an important source of new capacity and one of the fastest growing sources of new capacity on the grid. The kind of changing and uncertain rules around what qualifies for tax credits is something that can significantly dampen investment. And so if we're injecting a lot of policy uncertainty in an environment of rising costs and rising demand, that's only going to have kind of negative effects overall.
Great, thank you. Ryan, you mentioned something very interesting earlier, like that some states have been able to actually meet the demand, the growing demand that they've faced. So when you look at some of those states that have had an increase, and you mentioned California, where you said a lot of it was driven by wildfires, but there are others as well. When you have to compare kind of like market design issues with governance issues, with physical supply constraints, what do you think are some of the major factors here? Like, is the physical supply more important, or can actually market design alleviate some of those bottlenecks if it's done right?
Oh, it can definitely alleviate some of those bottlenecks if it's done right. And maybe I'll just go back to the forced analogy that Abe made earlier about AI data centers being toddlers. If they are currently toddlers, I would posit that about 2 years we had an unexpected birth, and the unexpected birth was AI data centers. I mean, Abe mentioned that it was only a couple of years ago that capacity prices in PJM were at all-time lows, right? This was an era. I mean, maybe this is a failure of forecasting, is what this is, right? None of us were talking about AI data centers 3 years ago. And so I think that, to this point of how unique is the situation, one big aspect of the uniqueness is that we have a form of demand that none of us in the industry, hardly any of us in the industry, envisioned until very, very recently. And wholesale markets confront this more rapidly. They're more on the knife's edge in a way because of a marginal cost clearing mechanism that is similar to all other markets, but especially for a commodity with very little storage, can cause some real knife edge solutions, as has been observed in PJM. And obviously it's causing a real rethink in PJM about wholesale market design, the proper role of the capacity market, whether it's appropriate to price discriminate against certain customers that are new and in many ways unexpected. I think it's gonna take some time to figure this out, and we need to recognize that it's only within the last year or so that we've really started to try to figure it out, because it isn't something that any of us really forecasted a couple years ago.
Can I jump?
Yeah,
jump
please jump in here.
So I think it's really important. This is something I talk to my students about a lot. If you have a utility and you serve 100 customers, each customer is contributing $1. Your cost of running the utility is $100, right? Nice and simple. Serving that 101st customer is less than that extra dollar. So you're going to earn $1 of revenue from that new customer, and you're not going to have $1 of increased cost. So everyone's rates go down just a little bit. That is what Ryan is talking about when he talks about how areas with either increasing or decreasing load growth have seen price either increases or decreases, right? So it is really important to recognize. I mean, this is the magic. This is the one weird trick that has driven electrification in this country. Because generally, it's like the ultimate network effect. The more customers you have, the lower everyone's costs get. So why doesn't that apply to data centers? Well, it might. And this is where a lot of my research it really focuses on. It's not that data centers are long-term going to drive increased costs. It's the very short-term stuff we're seeing right now, where we're seeing, real dislocation in prices that's dramatically affecting customers. But then the second piece of it is the risk. And we all know that the load forecast, when we talk about 30, 40, 50 gigawatts of new data center load in the next decade, we all know that those are wrong. We just don't know how badly they're wrong or whether they're wrong high or wrong low. So a big part of this is making sure that we allocate the risk that we are wrong in our load forecast and make sure that the customers who are causing that risk are the ones that pay for it. And Ryan mentioned, we are spending a lot of time. I mean, Joe and I have been spending some real quality time in Valley Forge at PJM, having discussions about market design and who pays and how to design it in the right way. That is my love language. I love that kind of stuff, but it is incredibly difficult to do. But it sort of comes back to this question of we just don't know how much electricity data centers are going to use. Maybe quantum computing is going to come around tomorrow and reduce electricity usage by 50%. Maybe there'll be more efficient chips. Maybe there'll be consolidation, or maybe it's all a bubble and they'll all go bust. I honestly don't know. But we need to put, sort of our job as sort of regulatory professionals is to put in place a scheme that is robust and protects consumers under any of those various scenarios. And so when you talked about scarcity, we can't have scarcity in AI. I don't disagree with that. But it's not about scarcity. It's about who pays. Google, Microsoft, Meta, take your pick. They are all perfectly capable of financing and building new power plants. They are the largest entities on the planet. They can do it. It's just an unwillingness to pay at this point. Because right now, they're still sort of in this old regime where we take these costs and socialize them across the entire grid because everybody wants that new factory. The load associated with EV electrification is broadly, those benefits are broadly spread across society. Now we have this sort of new, unique class of data centers where the costs are being allocated and spread out across all consumers, but the benefits are being concentrated, in a few very, very wealthy corporations. And so it is all about not slowing this down, but about making sure that they are internalizing the actual cost of the electricity that they use.
So how can we improve our forecasting, given that we've been pretty wrong about this, as Ryan just pointed out? And there's so many uncertainties, especially in an area that is moving so fast, where every 2 months there's a new development.
Yeah,
every day probably.
That is a great question. And there's a lot of things we can do to improve the load forecast. Mm-hmm. We talk about this ad nauseum. But what we really need to do is recognize that whatever the best in practice load forecast we have, it's going to be wrong. And we need to make sure that the risk associated with that wrongness are put off on the right customers. And so what does that mean? For example, a new 1,000 megawatt data center wants to hook up to the grid. Currently, we hook them up and ask questions later. We go out and buy, on behalf of all of us, the electricity and the capacity that that data center needs to operate. We build a transmission for that data center, and we effectively allocate those costs to everybody in the room. What we need to do is be like, okay, data center, you need a $2.5 billion power plant. Okay, go out and build it or sign a contract to pay for it. And you need $500 million in new transmission infrastructure. All right, here's the bill. When you pay it and put up the appropriate collateral and security such that the risk won't be transferred over to us if you go bankrupt or leave the system in 2 to 3 years, we'll do it. That's not the problem. It's just a matter of taking and segregating those costs out. We sometimes refer to it as ring fencing, and make sure that grandma isn't somehow inadvertently subsidizing the big tech data bill, because that's obviously immoral, but also totally unpalatable politically.
So that is a good segue into the next section, which is what can we do about it, right? This is a problem that is politically pretty salient. It has factored quite prominently in some of the state level elections. It is going to factor in the midterm elections, and we've got a couple of audience questions here what the federal government might do about it. Ryan, let's start with you. What are some of the solutions that you see for those markets and those states where we have seen those spikes that are quite acute for a lot of the people in those areas that could be brought down? What can policymakers or regulators realistically do in the short term?
I think in the very short term, it's all about cost allocation.
Okay.
It's going to take time to bring new supply on board, but in the very near term, it has to be about cost allocation and making sure that the data centers and the large load really pay their freight. It's as simple as that. And look, every market is going to be different about how that happens. In vertically integrated markets, as I mentioned before, it's basically, in effect, a negotiation between the utility, the regulator, and the large load customer. Complicated negotiation, but basically three parties, along with a number of other stakeholder groups that will want to participate in that particular proceeding. In wholesale markets, Abe, I'm sure, has all of the answers for PJM. It's very simple region. No, I mean, the answers are going to be different, but I think ultimately it's really about making sure that whatever the market structure is, that we're as much as possible reducing the risk for the rest of the customer base. And there are things that are very different about the large load customers that we're currently talking about, and one of them is their ability and willingness to pay. We've never had large load customers that had the resources and the profit margins, to be just really brutally frank here, to be able to pay their own way. Aluminum smelter was not gonna sign up with a fusion company or a small modular reactor and try to bring that to market. I don't remember any large manufacturing facility signing up with Fervo or Form Energy. I mean, it's these data centers, they have resources. Mm-hmm. And we need to make sure that we don't stick the data centers with costs beyond that which they should be assigned to be assured. But yeah, we need to protect the rest of the rate base for that purpose.
So who plays the role in there? Is it like the state level regulators? Is it that could push for that, given that they have the pressures from the constituents? Is it state level politicians? Kind of like who can play a role here?
Sure. I mean, so Abe, you should jump in here too. It's going to vary by region again. I think that in the vertically integrated markets, a lot of it is the regulator. It's their responsibility. It is the fundamental responsibility of public utility regulators to designate, to establish rates in a way that is appropriately cost causal in effect. And so certainly the retail rate-making entities, i.e. the public utility commissions, will play an enormous role. But certainly it is also true in wholesale markets, whether it's PJM or ERCOT or California ISO. The wholesale market rules also matter. And we're going to be exploring new approaches to allocating generation costs, certainly in the PJM market. I know that in ERCOT in Texas, there are very active conversations about how transmission costs are allocated and whether the current approach to allocating transmission costs imposes undue burdens on some customer classes versus others. So I think the flavor will vary from region to region, but certainly the state regulators and the wholesale markets themselves and all of the stakeholders then associated with those wholesale markets will be playing important roles.
Brandon, what are your thoughts on solutions to bring the rates down?
In the near term, I very much agree that this is really fundamentally a cost allocation question. Though I think we should think a little bit more broadly around where we can allocate some of these costs. And when I look at some of these cost drivers, say mitigating wildfire risk in California, or perhaps protecting some of the lowest income customers from these rising costs, there's an important role for other revenue sources beyond ratepayer funding to potentially help pay for some of these costs that are broadly socially beneficial. I think that should be on the radar of state houses and governors. It certainly was a portion of, particularly with energy efficiency investments that were made through IRA tax credits, was a portion of the federal policy landscape until recently. But I think we should be thinking certainly about where some of these broadly socially beneficial costs could be funded from non-ratepayer funding sources. In the medium term, I think there are also some important reforms that we need to start moving on. And some of those are just figuring out how to get supply to be built faster than it's currently being built. So if we are if we have to wait for 5 years for a project to get through the interconnection queue, and another several years for it to get through permitting, there's really no hope in supplying new data center demand by 2027 or 2028, because those timelines are so radically different. I think back to this example of Texas, one of the things that the ERCOT market in Texas has going for it is a very efficient, very fast interconnection process, and Texas has very lax permitting standards, and it's very easy to get a project built there. And as a result, project developers can see that demand coming and build for it. And I think that's a large reason why the load growth in Texas, around 10 gigawatts of increased load just in the last few years, has been met with a huge surge in solar and energy storage build out, and some gas as well, but it's largely been met with solar and energy storage. So I think we need to be thinking about how to improve those interconnection policies. There's some states that have recently looked at, I think Virginia's State House just passed a bill, not yet signed into law, that would require the utilities to investigate potential options for surplus interconnection at existing points of interconnection to get new resources connected to the grid faster. You could add energy storage to existing solar sites, or add solar and wind at an existing gas peaker site. Those sites already studied for interconnection. You can have a much simpler, more efficient process. And encouraging things like virtual power plants or distributed resources, where there might be fewer interconnection and permitting barriers to getting that capacity scaled up faster. I think we need to look at all of these options to meet demand, especially in that medium term window.
Abe, what about you? What are your some thoughts on kind of like solutions for this? And we had an audience question. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What do you think the administration could do at the federal level before the midterms, or would try to do to alleviate the costs? Because obviously it's going to be a salient issue in the elections.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually a lot of my scholarship and work involves working with state regulators in particular to come to consensus on how to deal with these issues. It's a very complicated question, and one of the things that makes this field so difficult is the different jurisdictional frameworks that exist. So the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, under the Federal Power Act of 1935, has jurisdiction over sales for resale and transmission. States have jurisdiction over retail sales. So data centers fit in this very uncomfortable space where they're retail consumers, so they're under a state jurisdiction, but they're so big that they affect wholesale prices. And so we have a lot of, frankly, a little bit of hide the ball. I don't know who's listening to this, but okay. The data centers are coming in and kind of playing off the state regulators and the federal regulators against each other a little bit. Because, they will tell the feds, oh, we want to be regulated by the states when it comes to cost allocation. And then the states come in and say, well, we can't really do that. That's too, we have these cross-border impacts that can only be regulated at the federal level. So really, there's this term cooperative federalism, which I really love. And what it really says is that you need state regulators and their federal regulator compatriots to get together and fill in the gaps. Because right now there's this giant gap that all the data center regulation is falling into. So we want them all to get together and talk. And, I have to say, it has been 3 weeks ago, I think it was, we had the President of the United States and the Energy Dominance Council, Secretaries Burgum and Wright, along with 13 governors from the PJM region, which includes both red state and blue state governors, all coming together to sign a statement on principles about how these costs should be allocated. The Governor Moore and President Trump probably have not agreed on very much over the last few years. But on this issue, we're seeing this fascinating bipartisan national consensus emerging that we need to have the data centers paying their own way. And I'll share two of my absolute favorite acronyms, which are Bring Your Own Generation, BYOG, and the even better one, which is Beyonce, Bring Your Own Clean Energy. And what we really want is we want to set up a system where the data centers, using their own balance sheets, are going out and entering into long-term firm take-or-pay contracts, funding the infrastructure that we're building on their behalf. And as long as we do that, the lion can lay down with the lamb and everybody will be happy. The data centers will get the connections they need, they'll get the power that they need to operate, and we will be insulating retail consumers. And so a lot of the work that I do, and I see this happening, and Joe does as well, is people saying not it. They don't want to take on the hot potato. They don't want to be the ones to actually have to sign a 15-year contract for a $2.5 billion new generator backed by appropriate collateral and financial guarantees. That's hard. That's expensive. And why would they do that unless they have to?
That's very interesting. I want to turn to a couple of audience questions, which is one of them relates to geothermal and the potential for like more medium and long-term new generation. So I'm curious what you think about the potential for geothermal to kind of like be built out in the United States. Brandon, you want to start? You want to take that one?
Sure. I think in the long run, geothermal is a very promising new technology. I think it's worth recognizing that when you look at a map of where there is geothermal resource potential, it is concentrated. So there's a lot of it in a number of Western states, Nevada, Utah, Oregon, but there's some hot spots in parts of the East as well. But I think it's one of those resources that can be very regionally important. And there is a lot of technological progress happening there with companies developing new mechanisms of drilling and accessing and proving out those geothermal resources. So I have a lot of hope for geothermal as a resource to grow and expand, particularly in those regions where there's good resource available. I think particularly across the West, it's going to be a really essential new resource.
Great, thank you. Ryan, I have another audience question for you. So you mentioned it earlier, right? Like that the sun shines much less in New England, and there's a lot of variation in renewables across states. I've seen economists argue that like once you kind of like transition an economy fully to renewables, that electricity prices are going to be much lower. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, we have some examples in Spain where it's going in that direction, but then obviously it depends very highly on kind of like how intermittent it is, how reliable. So I'm curious, what do you think?
I think it's context dependent, to be sure. You know, there are plenty of regions in the country that have very windy land, very sunny land. In those regions, solar and wind can make strict economic sense, forgetting any kind of broader societal considerations, just focused on the dollars and cents. There are certainly regions of the country that would continue to deploy wind and especially solar and batteries at scale as a mechanism of depressing or pushing down retail electricity prices. There's other regions that are not so endowed. And so I don't think there's a uniform answer. Certainly our country is very well endowed with resources writ large. Mm-hmm. But as per Brendan's point, specific to geothermal, but also true for other resources, there's substantial geographic variation of where those resources are most attractive.
You know, and I'll just point out, this is where my answer is competition in markets. Yep. There has never been more money on the table for someone who can bring new sources of electricity to market quickly. Like whether it's geothermal, nuclear, wind, magic boxes in your basement, if you can deliver it in the next couple of years, you will be rich, like really rich. And so, you know, I'm very interested in all the different technologies, and yeah, geothermal is wonderful. You know, all these technologies are wonderful. But at the end of the day, we have like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for a technology entrepreneur who can actually get this done. And that is the beauty of markets, right? We don't have to make those decisions. We're sending the price signals, we're setting the rules of engagement, and the market will bring it in if it can do it. And so, you know, great, let's do geothermal, let's do batteries. When I sort of think about what the market is telling us right now, it's telling us that really the only things we can get deployed in the next couple of years at scale tend to be either projects that are well underway, shovel ready, or more likely battery storage, virtual power plants, things that we can, you know, that are sort of already in flight in some way or don't require major grid infrastructure. But there's plenty of opportunity for geothermal inventors and other technology inventors to go to your favorite big tech company and get a wonderfully lucrative contract. So those incentives are there.
Great, that's good to know. Alternative career for anyone. Brandon, final thoughts from your side, and then Ryan.
Yeah, I guess on this particular point, I very much agree with what Abe was saying about markets as a very important driver of these solutions. I think when I think about regions like New England, we also need to think about portfolios of resources. So they might not have as good of onshore wind or solar resources in some of these New England states. The offshore wind resource is one of the best in the nation, and that is something that many of the states recognized. They developed strategies to tap into that offshore wind resource. And the challenge there is to create and sustain development of an industry so that you can bring costs down. You build the ports, you build the labor force, you build the supply chain that can support a sustained industry. And right now, it's uncertainty. It's that policy uncertainty that comes in and it disrupts the process of building out an industry. Europe had an offshore wind strategy. that through repeated deployment of this technology, they were able to bring costs down to a level that was pretty competitive with other wholesale sources. Offshore wind in the east, on the East Coast, has great winter reliability benefits. It's very complementary to some of these other resources. And so when we look at what's happening around offshore wind as an example, but I think we need to kind of take this policy uncertainty as a broader theme, as something that we need to resolve to be able to realize cost reductions, build new resources, realize some of the savings. And reducing that policy uncertainty is really going to enable the markets that Abe is talking about that can really help drive this innovation. And so that's one of my takeaways is one of the things we should focus on.
I love that, because nothing is more poisonous to investment than uncertainty, right? And to making planning. Ryan, please, final words.
I guess my final word here is that we have focused quite a lot on large load customers, properly so, especially for those of you located in the DC metro area. But as I mentioned, for most of the country, the retail price increases that we've experienced have nothing to do with load growth. And so for all of us that live in those other states, we need to be thinking about a different set of possible regulatory and policy measures to try to control the significant increases that have been experienced in some of those places. So that's for another webinar, another event, perhaps someday in the future. But certainly we need to kind of move beyond just an exclusive focus on the large load customers.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Please give a big round of applause to our panelists. And thank you, Brenton. Thank you, Ryan, for dialing in, and all the best. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. This has been great.